Waitress slipped a note to the Mafia boss. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. The blonde's manicured fingers brushed her diamond earring twice in rapid succession, and Isabella's blood turned to ice because that was a sniper confirmation signal, and the man sitting across from her with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows was about to have his skull opened by a rifle round traveling 3,000 feet per second. The girlfriend smiled sweetly while typing on her phone under the table, and Isabella had maybe 45 seconds before Dominic Russo's brains decorated the expensive wallpaper behind him, and she was already moving, order pad in hand, scribbling words that would either save a life or end her own. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. She crossed the restaurant floor with her heart hammering because 4 years of CIA training was screaming that intervening would blow her cover and mark her for death. But watching a man die while she served champagne wasn't something she could live with. So Isabella walked straight into the kill zone and slid that note under Dominic's menu while his traitorous girlfriend talked about shopping and an assassin across the street lined up his shot. Wait, stop everything. Before we go 1 second further, I need to know where you're watching from. What city? What country? Drop it in the comments right now. And what time is it where you are? Are you supposed to be sleeping? Working? Doesn't matter because you need to hit that subscribe button immediately because what happens in the next 30 seconds will leave you absolutely destroyed. In part 3, when Dominic discovers Isabella's real identity and why she was hiding, you are not ready for that twist. Now let's get back because that sniper has his finger on the trigger. Isabella reached table 7 and the blonde looked up with a practiced smile of someone beautiful and bored by service staff. Isabella set down water and nobody ordered and made direct eye contact with Dominic in a way that violated every rule of professional service, her expression communicating everything. Read it now. Don't react. You have seconds. Dominic registered her intensity and his hand moved casually toward the menu while his girlfriend launched into another story about boutiques and sales. Isabella backed away, positioning herself to see both the table and the building across the street where sunlight had glinted off glass in a way that meant scope and rifle and death incoming. Dominic read the note, and every muscle in his body shifted microscopically in ways only someone with tactical training would recognize. He didn't freeze or panic, just kept nodding at his girlfriend's shopping tail while his left hand dropped below the table, signaling his security. 2 men in suits who'd been sitting separately suddenly stood and moved with coordinated purpose. Dominic told his girlfriend something about wanting better lighting for photos because she looked so beautiful tonight, suggesting they move to a different table. The blonde smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and Isabella saw cold calculation flash behind those blue eyes the moment she realized the plan was failing. They stood, and Dominic guided his girlfriend toward the restaurant's interior away from the windows, while his security formed a human wall. The blonde protested about her meal getting cold, but Dominic was already settling into a corner table with his back to solid wall and zero sight lines from outside. Isabella watched the blonde's hand drift toward her earring again and moved on instinct. She stumbled hard into the woman, sent her phone skittering across the floor, and apologized profusely while the blonde hissed about clumsy, incompetent staff. The phone disappeared into Isabella's apron pocket, and the assassination window slammed shut. Dominic's eyes tracked Isabella's every movement, and she saw recognition there, understanding that she'd just intercepted a kill order. His security was already at the windows, one speaking urgently into his sleeve. The blonde demanded her phone back, and Isabella stammered about checking it for damage, about restaurant policy, buying precious seconds. The manager appeared looking stressed, and Isabella caught Dominic's eyes across the chaos. He gave the smallest nod. Suddenly, the manager was sympathetic, ushering the blonde toward the bar for complimentary wine, and Isabella found herself flanked by security, being firmly escorted toward the kitchen. In the back office with the door closed, Dominic's head of security demanded to know who Isabella was and how she'd identified an active hit. Isabella decided her cover was already destroyed the moment she'd passed that note. She told them her real name was Isabella Martinez, former CIA counterintelligence, for years tracking terror cells and criminal organizations before she'd burned out and disappeared into Waitress anonymity. She'd recognized a spotter signal because she'd used them herself dozens of times. She handed over the blonde's phone and detailed her observations about sniper position and signal timing. The security chief's expression shifted from suspicion to professional respect. He made a call in rapid Italian and told Isabella that Mr. Russo wanted to speak with her immediately, but first they had to secure the situation. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos. Police arrived responding to reports of a gunman on a rooftop across the street. The blonde was detained after her phone revealed encrypted messages coordinating the assassination. Dominic remained ice-calm throughout, giving statements while his lawyers materialized. Isabella stayed in the kitchen, watching through the crack as the woman who'd been seconds from murdering her boyfriend was led away in handcuffs, screaming about misunderstandings. The restaurant was evacuated and sealed for investigation. Isabella should have vanished in the confusion, but Dominic's security made clear she wasn't leaving until their boss thanked his savior personally. When police and customers finally cleared out, only Dominic, his team, and Isabella remained in the empty restaurant. Dominic approached, and Isabella found herself looking up at a man whose reputation for calculated violence was legendary. He asked why she'd risked herself for a stranger, why she'd sacrificed her cover and safety for someone she didn't know. Isabella told him the truth. She'd left CIA work because she was exhausted from watching bad things happen while bureaucracy prevented action, and when she'd seen that signal she'd had a choice between staying safe and silent or doing something that mattered. She'd chosen action because underneath the waitress uniform and fake employment history, that's who she actually was. Dominic studied her with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. He explained that his girlfriend, now ex, had been sleeping with his rival and agreed to set up the hit in exchange for territory and protection. The betrayal stung not because of love, but because he'd trusted her enough to be vulnerable, had lowered his guard, and nearly died for that mistake. Then he looked at Isabella and said something that stopped her breath. He told her true loyalty was rare and precious, that she'd demonstrated more integrity in 60 seconds than most people showed in lifetimes, and that he owed her a debt money couldn't repay. Isabella started protesting that she didn't want anything, had just done what felt right, but Dominic cut her off. He told her the CIA operative turned waitress life was finished because his enemies now knew she'd interfered, which made her target. He could leave her to handle that alone, or bring her under his protection and give her work that actually used her skills instead of wasting them carrying plates. He asked if she'd consider working for him doing security consultation and threat assessment, using her intelligence background to keep his organization ahead of incoming dangers. The pay would be substantial, and the work would matter in ways serving overpriced pasta never could. Isabella's first instinct was refusal, because working for a crime boss violated everything her government service had represented. But then she thought about the reality of those CIA years, the moral compromises and operations that had sickened her, how good people died while bureaucrats argued jurisdiction. At least with Dominic the lines were clear, loyalty ran both directions, and she'd be protecting people who actually protected their own rather than serving institutions that treated operatives as disposable. She told Dominic she needed time to think, and he surprised her by accepting without pressure. He gave her a card with a phone number and told her to call when she decided, and that regardless of her choices, people would watch her back because the rival organization didn't forgive interference. Isabella left as dawn broke. Her waitress shift transformed into something she couldn't have predicted. She walked to her apartment knowing it wasn't safe anymore, that everything had changed the moment she'd scribbled that warning. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Car outside is mine. Driver will take you anywhere you need. You saved my life tonight. Let me return the favor. Dr." Isabella looked out her window and saw a black Mercedes idling with a driver who nodded when he saw her face. She grabbed her go bag, kept packed from operational habit, and made her decision. Going back to invisibility wasn't an option. Moving forward into Dominic's dangerous world might be her only real choice. Drop a comment if Isabella should take Dominic's offer. Subscribe because the next part reveals what happens when she walks into his world ready to work. Share with anyone who loves loyalty meeting danger. This story is about to explode, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Isabella called the number on Dominic's card 3 hours later after she'd showered and changed and accepted that her old life was permanently over. A male voice answered immediately like they'd been waiting for her call and gave her an address in the financial district with instructions to arrive at 10 a.m. She spent the remaining time researching Dominic Russo through databases she technically shouldn't still have access to, but did because burning bridges with intelligence agencies was never truly complete. What she found was a complex picture. A man who'd inherited his father's organization at 23 and had spent the last decade consolidating power while simultaneously reducing violence. A crime boss who paid for community centers and funded scholarship programs while running protection rackets and money laundering operations. The contradictions were fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The address led to a glass and steel tower in the business district, legitimate corporate offices for a dozen shell companies that funneled Dominic's various enterprises. Isabella rode the elevator to the 20th floor, where 2 security guards checked her ID against a list and escorted her to a corner office with a view of the entire city. Dominic stood by the window in a charcoal suit looking like any other corporate executive except for the neck tattoo barely visible above his collar and the predatory stillness that marked him as something else entirely. He turned when she entered, and his expression shifted into something that might have been relief or approval or both. He told her he hadn't been certain she'd come, that he'd given her choice, even odds given what accepting meant about the life she was choosing. Isabella told him she'd made peace with moral ambiguity during her CIA years, when she'd watched the agency support dictators and arm insurgents while claiming moral high ground. At least Dominic was honest about what he was and didn't pretend his hands were clean while doing dirty work. She'd come because she needed purpose and protection, and because wasting her skills serving food was a slow death of the soul. Dominic smiled, and it transformed his face from dangerous to almost warm. He told her that honesty was rare in his world where everyone wore masks and played angles, and her directness was refreshing even if it would probably cause problems with people not used to being told hard truths. He laid out what her role would entail: analyzing threats, vetting new associates, identifying law enforcement attention, and essentially being his eyes for dangers he couldn't see because he was too close to his own organization. She'd have access to everything, complete transparency into his operations, because she couldn't assess threats without understanding the full picture. That level of access meant trust, and trust in Dominic's world was earned through loyalty proven over time. But he was choosing to trust her immediately based on 60 seconds of action in a restaurant, gambling that someone who'd risked themselves for a stranger would honor the commitment once made. Isabella felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders and told him she wouldn't betray it, that when she committed to something, she went all in because half measures got people killed. The first week was immersion training, where Dominic's Lieutenant Marco walked Isabella through every aspect of the organization structure. She met enforcers and accountants, learned about protection territories and smuggling routes, saw the ugly mechanics of how organized crime actually functioned beneath the romanticized media version. What surprised her was the order and efficiency. The way Dominic ran his empire like a Fortune 500 company with HR policies and retirement plans and rules about acceptable violence. Marco explained that Dominic had inherited chaos from his father and spent years transforming it into something sustainable, reducing the body count while increasing profits because dead rivals were bad for business and police attention was expensive. Isabella's operational background let her identify vulnerabilities immediately. She pointed out surveillance gaps and communication weaknesses, noted which associates were living beyond their visible means, suggesting skimming or side deals, identified law enforcement patterns that meant someone was cooperating. Dominic listened to her assessments with intensity and implemented her recommendations without ego or defensiveness. Within 2 weeks, she'd restructured his security protocols and identified 3 separate threats, including a federal investigation, a rival organization planning expansion into Dominic's territory, and an accountant who was selling information to the FBI. The accountant situation required immediate handling, and Dominic brought Isabella to the confrontation because he wanted her to understand how his world dealt with betrayal. They met the man in a warehouse where the acoustics made every sound echo, and the isolation made clear nobody was coming to help. Dominic didn't yell or threaten, just laid out the evidence Isabella had compiled in a folder that documented 2 years of cooperation with federal agents. The accountant tried to lie, then begged, then offered to become a double agent feeding false information. Dominic listened to all of it and then told the man that betrayal was the one unforgivable sin, that you could steal or fight or even kill within certain parameters, but selling out your people meant you had no value left to extract. Isabella watched Dominic's enforcer Marco escort the accountant toward the back of the warehouse and knew she should feel something, should protest or object, but found herself numb to it. The man had endangered everyone in the organization, including support staff and families, had sold information that could have sent dozens to prison, and the moral calculus was clearer than half the operation she'd supported at the CIA. When Marco returned alone 10 minutes later, Dominic asked Isabella if she had a problem with how things were handled. She told him the truth. She'd authorized drone strikes that killed targets and anyone standing nearby, so she had no moral high ground to judge his handling of a traitor. Dominic studied her face like he was seeing something that confirmed his suspicion and told her that most people lied about being comfortable with necessary violence. But she owned it without pretending to be something she wasn't. The professional relationship began shifting into something else during late nights, working in Dominic's office reviewing threat assessments and planning responses. They'd order takeout and work through operational problems together. Isabella's intelligence, training, complementing Dominic's street-level understanding of power dynamics. He asked about her CIA years, and she found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone. Missions that had gone sideways and moral compromises that had slowly eroded her faith in the institution she'd served. Dominic shared his own history. The father who'd ruled through fear and violence. The choice to take over at 23 after his father was killed. The decade spent transforming brutality into something approaching civilization without losing the edge that kept him alive. Isabella realized she was attracted to him during a crisis when a rival organization attempted a hit on one of Dominic's properties. She'd been coordinating the response from his office when he'd walked in covered in someone else's blood, adrenaline still pumping from direct confrontation. He'd looked at her and asked if she was okay, and the concern in his voice had been genuine. Like her safety mattered more than the attack he'd just survived. She'd told him she was fine, and he'd nodded and moved to clean up, but something in that moment had shifted, had made her see him not just as her employer, but as a man who'd chosen to trust her completely and whose intensity drew her like gravity. Dominic must have felt it too, because his hand had lingered when passing her documents. His eyes had tracked her movements around the office with an attention that went beyond professional, and twice she'd caught him staring at her with an expression that made her breath catch. The attraction was dangerous and complicated by power dynamics and professional boundaries, but Isabella found herself not caring about those considerations as much as she should. She'd spent 4 years at the CIA, maintaining perfect professional distance and emotional control, and maybe she was tired of being careful, tired of denying what she wanted because of arbitrary rules about appropriate behavior. The breaking point came 3 months into working for Dominic when she'd identified a threat that required immediate action. A detective who'd been investigating Dominic's organization had been reassigned to a task force with broader authority and more resources. Isabella had hacked his emails and found evidence he was planning raids on multiple properties simultaneously, a coordinated strike meant to overwhelm Dominic's warning systems. She brought the intel to Dominic at midnight, because waiting until morning meant losing the advantage. He'd been at his house rather than the office and had answered the door in workout clothes, clearly having been training in his home gym. Isabella had briefed him on the threat, while trying not to notice the way his shirt clung to his frame or how his face looked without the usual armor of expensive suits. Dominic had listened intently and made immediate calls to move product and sanitize locations, his mind working through the chess moves required to stay ahead of law enforcement. After the calls, he thanked Isabella and told her she'd just saved him from major legal exposure. that her vigilance was the difference between running his empire and running it from a federal prison. She'd said it was just her job, and he'd stepped closer and told her it was more than that she'd become essential to his life in ways that went beyond professional. Isabella had closed the distance between them and kissed him before rational thought could intervene, before she could talk herself out of it with arguments about power dynamics and professional boundaries. Dominic had responded immediately, his hands tangling in her hair, kissing her back with intensity that suggested he'd been holding back for months. They'd ended up against the wall of his entryway, then on his couch, then eventually in his bedroom, where the attraction they'd been dancing around finally found its conclusion. Afterward, lying tangled in his sheets, Isabella told him this was probably a terrible idea, and Dominic had laughed and agreed, but said that the best things in his life had always been terrible ideas executed perfectly. The relationship transformed everything while changing nothing about their professional dynamic. At work, Isabella remained his security consultant, challenging his decisions and identifying threats without softening her assessments. But after hours, she was something else, the woman who knew all his vulnerabilities and loved him anyway, who'd seen the violence and the tenderness and chose him despite the complications. Dominic treated her like she was precious, protecting her even as she protected him, making space in his dangerous life for something approaching normal. 4 months into their relationship, Dominic's ex-girlfriend made bail and immediately disappeared from police custody. Intelligence suggested she'd fled to Dominic's rival, who'd orchestrated the original assassination attempt. Isabella tracked communications indicating they were planning something bigger, a coordinated attack meant to eliminate Dominic and several key lieutenants simultaneously. The threat was serious enough that Dominic's entire organization went to heightened alert, everyone moving to secured locations while Isabella worked to identify the specifics of the incoming assault. The attack came 3 days later at dawn, when most of the city was still sleeping and Dominic's guard was theoretically lowest. Isabella woke to her phone, exploding with alerts from the surveillance network she'd installed across Dominic's properties. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions, coordinated timing, professional execution that screamed military training rather than street thugs. She was already throwing on clothes and grabbing her weapon when Dominic's security chief, Marco, burst through the bedroom door shouting that they had incoming on 3 fronts simultaneously. Dominic was up instantly, the switch from sleeping to combat-ready happening in seconds, and Isabella watched him transform from the man who'd held her gently hours ago into the crime boss who'd survived a decade of assassination attempts through sheer calculated violence. Marco rattled off positions while Dominic issued commands in rapid Italian, coordinating defensive positions across the estate. Isabella pulled up her surveillance feeds on her tablet and analyzed the attack pattern, immediately identifying that this wasn't meant to kill Dominic, but to flush him toward a specific exit where the real ambush waited. She told Dominic he couldn't leave the house through any of the obvious routes, that his ex-girlfriend knew his security protocols because she'd lived here for 2 years, and every escape route he'd use instinctively was compromised. Dominic asked where she suggested, and Isabella pointed to the old coal chute in the basement that had been sealed decades ago, a route nobody knew about because it predated modern security surveys and wasn't on any of the architectural plans his ex could have accessed. They moved toward the basement while gunfire erupted outside, the sound of automatic weapons tearing through the morning quiet. Dominic's men were returning fire from fortified positions, but Isabella knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, that holding the estate was impossible against this level of assault. Marco wanted to fight their way out through the garage, but Isabella overruled him, explained that the garage was exactly where the real kill team was positioned waiting for that exact move. Marco looked to Dominic, who backed Isabella's assessment without hesitation, trusting her tactical analysis over his lieutenant's combat instincts. They descended into the basement while the house above them shuddered with impacts, windows shattering and walls splintering under concentrated fire. The coal chute exit was sealed with concrete and required 10 minutes of brutal work with sledgehammers to break through while the sounds of battle intensified overhead. Isabella kept one eye on her surveillance feeds, watching Dominic's men getting systematically overwhelmed, watching the attackers breach the ground floor and begin clearing rooms with professional efficiency. She told Dominic they had maybe 3 minutes before hostiles reached the basement, and they needed to move immediately. The concrete finally gave way, revealing a narrow shaft leading to an exterior cold delivery door that opened onto an alley behind the property. Marco went first to secure the alley, then signaled all clear, and Isabella pushed Dominic toward the exit while pulling her own weapon because someone needed to cover their escape. Dominic refused to leave her behind and grabbed her arm, trying to pull her through the shaft, but Isabella yanked free and told him that one of them needed to slow the pursuit or they'd be shot in the alley like fish in a barrel. She had tactical training and had held choke points in worse situations than a basement stairwell. Dominic's face went through a dozen emotions in 2 seconds before settling on fury mixed with acceptance. He told her she had 30 seconds to get out before he came back for her whether she liked it or not, then disappeared through the coal chute with Marco pulling him forward. Isabella positioned herself at the basement stairs with her weapon trained on the door and counted down from 30 while listening to boots thundering overhead and voices coordinating the search. The basement door crashed open at 23 seconds, and Isabella fired 3 rounds that dropped the first man through and sent the others diving for cover. She used those precious seconds to sprint for the coal chute, squeezing through the narrow opening as bullets sparked off the concrete around her. She emerged into the alley, where Marco was waiting in an armored SUV with the engine running and Dominic was screaming at her from the open door. She threw herself into the vehicle and Marco gunned it before the door fully closed, tires screaming as they accelerated away from the estate. Behind them, the coal delivery door exploded outward and attackers emerged firing, but Marco was already executing a tactical driving pattern that made their vehicle impossible to track or target effectively. They drove for 20 minutes using counter-surveillance routes Isabella had designed specifically for this scenario, switching vehicles twice and using traffic patterns to confirm they'd lost any pursuit. Finally, they arrived at a safe house Isabella had established using untraceable funds, a property that didn't exist in any database connected to Dominic's organization. Inside the secure space, Dominic rounded on her with fury and fear warring in his expression. He told her that pulling a sacrifice play and nearly getting killed wasn't in her job description, that he needed her alive and functional, not playing hero in his basement. Isabella fired back that his dead body was even less useful, that someone had to delay pursuit, and she'd had the training and position to do it successfully, so arguing about it was pointless. Their argument escalated into shouting until Marco intervened by pulling up footage from the estate's surviving cameras showing the attackers executing wounded men who'd surrendered, showing Dominic's ex-girlfriend walking through the destruction with a smile, showing the rival organization boss directing his people to search every inch of the property. Marco pointed out that if Isabella hadn't identified the trap and found the coal chute exit, Dominic would be on that footage with a bullet in his head instead of arguing in a safe house. The reality check shut down the argument, but the tension remained. Dominic's fear for Isabella's safety butting against her refusal to be protected at the cost of his life. Isabella shifted focus to tactical assessment, pulling up intelligence on the rival organization's capabilities and resources. The attack had been expensive and sophisticated, requiring coordination and firepower beyond what a single criminal organization typically deployed. She suspected outside funding or support, possibly from law enforcement elements who wanted Dominic removed but couldn't do it legally. Dominic confirmed her suspicion by explaining that the detective who'd been investigating him had recently been fired for corruption, and fired cops with grudges and connections were dangerous wildcards who'd sell information and support to anyone willing to pay. The next 48 hours were spent in the safe house coordinating response while Dominic's organization regrouped and assessed damage. 7 of his men had died defending the estate, another dozen were wounded, and the property itself was destroyed beyond repair. The rival organization had claimed credit publicly, framing it as justified retaliation for Dominic's expansion into disputed territory. But Isabella's intelligence networks uncovered a different story. The ex-girlfriend had approached multiple organizations trying to coordinate a coalition against Dominic, promising that removing him would open territory for division among the remaining players. Most had refused because attacking Dominic was notoriously expensive, but one ambitious boss had seen opportunity and provided resources for the assault. Isabella presented Dominic with three options: retreat and rebuild from a position of temporary weakness, negotiate a truce that would cost territory and respect, or strike back immediately with overwhelming force that would re-establish his reputation for being untouchable. Dominic asked her assessment, and Isabella told him that retreat would be interpreted as weakness and invite more attacks, that negotiation from a damaged position would cost more than he could afford to lose, and that immediate retaliation was the only play that kept his organization intact. The problem was resources. They'd lost significant manpower and capability in the estate attack and didn't have a muscle for a full offensive. Isabella suggested an alternative: precision targeting rather than broad assault. Instead of trying to fight the entire rival organization, they'd eliminate the leadership and let the power vacuum tear the organization apart from within. She'd already identified the locations of the rival boss and his top lieutenants, had surveillance confirming their patterns and security weaknesses. A coordinated strike using Dominic's remaining loyal operators could decapitate the leadership in a single night, and without clear succession, the rival organization would collapse into infighting rather than maintaining offensive pressure. Dominic recognized the strategy from Isabella's CIA playbook: targeted elimination instead of conventional warfare, and approved the plan immediately. They spent 3 days planning the operation with the precision of a military campaign. Isabella coordinated intelligence gathering and route planning, while Dominic selected his most capable operators and briefed them on objectives. Marco would lead the team hitting the rival boss. Dominic would personally handle his ex-girlfriend because that betrayal demanded personal attention, and Isabella would run Overwatch coordinating communications and watching for law enforcement interference. Dominic tried to argue that Isabella should stay at the safe house, but she shut that down by reminding him that she'd run more field operations than everyone in his organization combined, and if he wanted this executed professionally, he needed her in the Tactical Operations Center, not hiding in a bunker. The night of the operation, Isabella set up in a commandeered office building with sight lines to all 3 target locations. She had surveillance feeds, police scanners, and communication channels with all teams displayed across multiple screens. Dominic's voice came through her earpiece, confirming his team was in position outside the hotel where his ex-girlfriend was staying under rival protection. Marco confirmed position outside the rival boss's restaurant headquarters. The third team confirmed ready at the lieutenant's residence. Isabella ran final checks on law enforcement positioning, confirmed no unusual patrol activity, and gave the green light for all teams to execute simultaneously. The operations went down with brutal efficiency. Marco's team breached the restaurant through the kitchen and reached the rival boss before his security could respond effectively. The third team hit the lieutenant's house with flashbangs and suppressed weapons, in and out in 90 seconds. Dominic's team entered the hotel through a service entrance and reached his ex-girlfriend's floor using key cards Isabella had cloned from hotel security systems. Isabella watched it all unfold through surveillance feeds and radio traffic, calling out security responses and police movement, keeping all 3 teams ahead of any interference. Dominic found his ex in her hotel room with packed bags, clearly about to run. Isabella listened through his open mic as he told the woman who tried to kill him that betrayal carried specific consequences in his world, that she'd known the rules when she'd made her choices. The woman tried to negotiate, offering information about other conspirators and federal investigations, but Dominic told her that some debts could only be paid one way. Isabella heard the suppressed gunshot and Dominic's voice reporting objective complete, requesting extraction route. She guided him to a stairwell that security cameras didn't cover and a vehicle that would disappear into traffic without being memorable. All 3 teams extracted successfully and converged on a secondary safe house by midnight. The operation had taken 17 minutes from first breach to last extraction, professional and clean with no law enforcement contact. The rival organization's leadership was eliminated, their structure was collapsing, and Dominic's reputation for responding to attacks with overwhelming force was reestablished. Isabella watched Dominic's exhausted operators celebrate their survival and success, watched Marco brief the teams on next steps, and felt the strange satisfaction of a mission executed perfectly according to plan. Dominic found Isabella on the safe house balcony an hour after the debrief, watching the city lights and processing what they'd just accomplished. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and told her that eliminating 3 targets simultaneously with 0 casualties on their side was the kind of operational success his organization had never achieved before her. Isabella leaned back against him and admitted she felt strange satisfaction from executing violence outside government oversight, like she'd finally aligned her skills with her actual values instead of serving institutional interests that change with political winds. Dominic asked if she regretted leaving the CIA, and Isabella laughed without humor, told him the agency had spent years teaching her to plan operations like tonight, but would have court-martialed her for executing them without proper authorization and paperwork. At least in Dominic's world, the mission parameters were clear and loyalty ran both directions. The next morning brought consequences faster than either anticipated. Federal agents raided 5 of Dominic's legitimate businesses simultaneously, clearly retaliation for the previous night's eliminations, even though no evidence connected him to the deaths. Isabella monitored the raids through her surveillance network and identified the detective who'd been fired for corruption as the source, someone feeding information and pushing federal contacts to harass Dominic's operations. The detective was operating outside official channels, but using law enforcement resources, a dangerous combination that meant he had protection somewhere up the bureaucratic chain. Isabella told Dominic they needed to neutralize this threat permanently, because a vengeful ex-cop with federal connections could destroy them through legal pressure, even if criminal rivals couldn't kill them directly. Dominic assembled his core team and laid out the situation while Isabella presented her intelligence file on the detective. The man lived alone in a modest house, drank heavily every night at the same bar, and had financial problems that suggested he was being paid for his information, but not enough to actually solve his debt issues. Marco suggested simply killing him, but Isabella argued that would trigger massive law enforcement retaliation because dead cops brought heat that criminal deaths didn't. Instead, she proposed they flip him, find leverage that turned him from enemy to unwilling ally. Dominic asked what leverage she had in mind, and Isabella pulled up files showing the detective had been skimming money from evidence rooms for years, stealing from drug seizures, and pocketing cash that should have been logged. Proof of that corruption delivered to the right people would end his career and potentially put him in prison alongside people he'd arrested. They approached the detective at his regular bar 3 nights later, Dominic and Isabella sliding into his booth, while Marco positioned himself to block any escape. The detective's face went through shock, then rage, then fear as he recognized who'd just cornered him. Dominic laid out the situation clearly. They had evidence of years of theft from evidence rooms, documentation that would destroy what remained of his reputation and guarantee federal prosecution. The detective could continue his vendetta and watch his life implode, or he could provide information about which federal agents were being fed intelligence and who was protecting him. In exchange, Dominic would bury the evidence, and the detective could drink himself to death in peace without prison time. The detective tried to bluster about having copies of his files in secure locations that would be released if anything happened to him. But Isabella cut through the bluff by pulling up his apartment security feed, showing her people retrieving those exact files 3 hours ago. She'd had his entire life penetrated and documented before they'd even approached him. The detective's shoulders sagged as he realized he had no leverage and no options. He admitted that an assistant district attorney with political ambitions had been using him to gather information on Dominic, seeing it as a high-profile case that could launch a campaign for higher office. The ADA was the one pushing federal agencies to investigate and raid, building a prosecution case that would make headlines even if the actual charges were relatively minor financial crimes. Isabella asked if the ADA had any vulnerabilities, and the detective laughed bitterly, said everyone had something they wanted hidden. The ADA was having an affair with a married judge, meeting at hotels, and being extremely careful about electronic communications. The detective had followed them once out of professional paranoia and had photos that could wreck both careers and marriages. He'd kept the photos as insurance against being sacrificed if the prosecution fell apart, but he'd hand them over now in exchange for keeping his freedom. Dominic took the detective's phone and had Isabella verify the photos were authentic before agreeing to the deal. The detective would feed false information to the ADA, leading investigations away from Dominic's actual operations. And in exchange, he'd get to keep his pension and his freedom, even if he'd lost everything else. Armed with photos of the ADA's affair, Isabella crafted a strategy that was pure intelligence tradecraft. Instead of directly blackmailing the ADA, which would make him defensive and unpredictable, she anonymously leaked the photos to a journalist who covered political corruption. The story broke 3 days later with enough detail to be devastating, but not enough to reveal the source. The ADA was suddenly fighting to save his career and marriage, too distracted by personal crisis to maintain pressure on Dominic's organization. The federal investigation stalled as their driving force collapsed, and Dominic's legitimate businesses returned to normal operations without constant law enforcement harassment. With immediate threats neutralized, Dominic began rebuilding his empire with Isabella as his strategic architect. She restructured his entire organization using principles from intelligence agencies, creating compartmentalization that limited exposure if any segment was compromised, establishing encrypted communications that couldn't be intercepted, and implementing background checks on all new associates that were more thorough than most government security clearances. Within 6 months, Dominic's organization was more secure and profitable than it had been in years, operating with efficiency that rival organizations couldn't match. Isabella's reputation within the criminal underworld grew into legend. The CIA operative who'd gone private and made one crime boss virtually untouchable. Their relationship deepened into something neither had expected to find in their violent worlds. Dominic treated Isabella as an equal partner rather than employee or girlfriend, consulting her on major decisions and trusting her judgment even when it contradicted his instincts. Isabella found herself building a life she'd never imagined, using skills the government had taught her, but applying them without the moral compromises that had driven her away. They moved into a new estate with security designed entirely by Isabella, a fortress that looked like a luxury home but could withstand anything short of military assault. Dominic proposed on the anniversary of a night she'd save his life in the restaurant, presenting her with a ring and asking if she'd marry a man whose world was violence, but whose heart was entirely hers. Isabella said yes while crying and laughing because she'd spent 4 years with the CIA, believing she'd never have normal things like marriage and family, that her career had traded away domestic happiness for operational excellence. But Dominic wasn't offering normal, was offering partnership in building an empire and defending it together, and that proposition felt more honest than any government recruitment pitch about serving her country. They married in a private ceremony with only Dominic's closest people present, Marco standing as best man and Isabella's former CIA handler, sending an encrypted message of congratulations that was equal parts approval and warning about burning bridges with dangerous people. The wedding night was interrupted by alerts that a new criminal organization was moving into the city, Russians with serious resources and reputation for extreme violence. Isabella immediately shifted into operational mode, gathering intelligence while Dominic assessed whether this was invasion or opportunity. Analysis revealed the Russians were fleeing prosecution in their home country and looking to establish new territory, which meant they'd be aggressive and desperate. Dominic suggested reaching out to negotiate territory division before violence became inevitable, using Isabella's intelligence to demonstrate strength and offer cooperation from a position of power rather than weakness. The meeting was arranged at neutral location with both sides bringing minimal security, a calculated risk that either prevented war or started it. Isabella accompanied Dominic over Marco's objections because she spoke fluent Russian from her CIA years and could read the subtext of cultural communications that Dominic might miss. The Russian boss Viktor Fedorov arrived with 2 bodyguards and an expression suggesting he expected betrayal at any moment. Dominic opened by acknowledging the Russians needed territory, and he was willing to discuss reasonable arrangements, that the city was large enough for multiple organizations if boundaries were respected. Victor studied them both with calculating eyes and then addressed Isabella directly in Russian, asking if she was truly CIA or if that was reputation inflation. Isabella responded in equally fluent Russian that her credentials were authentic, but her loyalty had shifted, that she'd found serving one man's clear vision more satisfying than serving government bureaucracy's confusion. Victor's expression shifted into something approaching respect, and he switched to English, telling Dominic that having a former intelligence operative as consigliere was either brilliant or insane. Dominic smiled and said it was definitely both, but it kept him alive through situations that should have killed him. They negotiated territory division for 3 hours, Isabella and Victor occasionally slipping into Russian for clarifications while Dominic watched the dynamic with amusement. Eventually, they reached an agreement. The Russians would take the waterfront territories Dominic had been planning to abandon anyway in exchange for intelligence, sharing about federal investigations and mutual defense against any organization that threatened either of them. The agreement held and transformed into unexpected alliance as Isabella and Victor developed professional respect that led to genuine intelligence cooperation. The Russians had different sources and methods than Dominic's organization, and combining intelligence networks created comprehensive coverage of law enforcement and rival activities. Isabella found herself coordinating with Russian intelligence officers who'd also left government service for more honest criminal employment, sharing tradecraft and laughing about bureaucratic stupidity they'd all escaped. The alliance made both organizations stronger and discouraged other groups from attempting expansion in a territory controlled by the Russo-Fedorov cooperation. 2 years after Isabella had passed that warning note in a restaurant, she stood in Dominic's rebuilt estate watching their combined organizations celebrate a major success. They'd intercepted a federal operation that would have damaged both organizations, turned it into a disaster for the task force instead, and demonstrated that attacking either of them meant fighting both. Isabella felt Dominic's arm around her waist and leaned into him while surveying the celebration. Marco caught her eye from across the room and raised his glass in salute, acknowledging without words that everything they'd built was because of her vision and capabilities. Victor approached with his characteristic slight smile and told Isabella in Russian that she'd accomplished something remarkable, transforming one criminal organization into a professional enterprise and forging an alliance that made both sides stronger. Isabella thanked him and switched to English, adding that she'd just applied basic intelligence principles to criminal enterprise, that most criminal organizations fail because they operated on loyalty and fear rather than structure and strategy. Victor laughed and said that describing organized crime as an intelligence problem was very American, but also very accurate. Dominic asked what they were discussing, and Isabella kissed his cheek and told him they were agreeing that his decision to trust a waitress who passed him a warning note was the best strategic choice he'd ever made. The alliance between Dominic and Victor lasted 18 months before a new threat emerged that tested everything Isabella had built. A cartel from Mexico began moving into the city with resources that dwarfed both organizations combined, buying politicians and law enforcement wholesale, establishing distribution networks that undercut everyone's prices. The cartel didn't negotiate or respect established territories, just rolled through like a tsunami, swallowing everything in its path. Isabella's intelligence networks identified the cartel leadership as former Mexican special forces who'd gone rogue and brought military tactics to criminal enterprise, professionals who made even seasoned operators look like amateurs. Dominic called an emergency meeting with Victor, and both men looked to Isabella for assessment and recommendations. Isabella laid out the brutal math. Fighting the cartel directly meant war neither organization could win. Their resources were simply outmatched. Cooperating with the cartel meant becoming subordinate and losing the independence they'd spent years building. The only viable option was forcing the cartel to negotiate from a position of perceived strength, even though actual strength was lacking. She proposed a strategy that was pure psychological warfare. Make the cartel believe the cost of conquest would exceed any potential profit. They'd hit cartel operations repeatedly using precision strikes that looked like much larger organizational capability, create the illusion of an army where only a strike team existed, make the cartel leadership paranoid about how deeply their organization had been penetrated. Dominic and Victor approved the plan, and Isabella began orchestrating the most complex operation of her career. She identified cartel stash houses and hit them with small teams using tactics that suggested insider information. She intercepted cartel communications and fed false intelligence that made their leadership suspect betrayal within their own ranks. She arranged for cartel members to be arrested at precisely coordinated moments that looked like someone was feeding perfect information to law enforcement. Within 3 weeks, the cartel leadership was seeing ghosts and suspecting everyone. Their expansion had stalled while they investigated internal security, and they'd lost more product and personnel than any rival organization had managed to inflict in years. The cartel leadership reached out requesting a meeting to discuss territorial arrangements, exactly what Isabella had been pushing them toward. The meeting was set for neutral ground in a hotel conference room with strict security protocols and no weapons allowed. Isabella insisted on attending over Dominic's protests because she needed to read the cartel leadership's reactions and adjust strategy in real time. They arrived to find the cartel had sent 3 representatives, including their intelligence chief, a former Mexican intelligence officer named Hector Salazar, who took one look at Isabella and started laughing. He told the room in accented English that he'd been trying to identify who was running operations against them and had suspected CIA involvement, but he'd never imagined it was actually a former CIA officer working for a local crime boss. Isabella asked how he'd identified her, and Hector explained that her operational signature was distinctly American intelligence tradecraft, the way she compartmentalized operations and used psychological warfare over direct violence. He'd worked with CIA officers during his government service and recognized the methodology immediately. Then he surprised everyone by suggesting they stop fighting and start cooperating because talent like Isabella's was too valuable to waste on internal competition. The cartel wasn't interested in controlling the city's traditional criminal operations. They just needed distribution networks for product moving to other markets. If Dominic and Victor provided that distribution in exchange for substantial profit sharing, everyone made more money and nobody had to keep bleeding resources on pointless conflict. Dominic looked skeptical, but Isabella ran the numbers in her head and realized Hector was right. The cartel had product and capital. Dominic and Victor had established distribution networks and political connections. Combining them created something more powerful than any organization operating separately. She told Dominic this was the play, that fighting was ego, not strategy, and partnership made everyone richer and safer. Victor agreed immediately because Russians understood pragmatic alliances better than honor-bound violence. Dominic took longer to accept, but finally nodded and asked what terms the cartel proposed. They spent 4 hours negotiating a partnership that transformed the city's criminal landscape. 3 organizations operating under a profit-sharing agreement that gave each control over their specialties while supporting the others. The partnership worked better than anyone expected. Cartel product moved through Dominic's distribution networks into Victor's connections with corrupt shipping companies, creating a pipeline that generated enormous profits for all parties. Isabella coordinated intelligence sharing between all 3 organizations, creating a security network that law enforcement couldn't penetrate because every major criminal enterprise in the city was working together instead of creating vulnerabilities fighting each other. Within a year, they'd effectively owned the city's underground economy, and Isabella's reputation had grown into legend. The woman who turned competing criminal organizations into a functioning cartel through strategic brilliance that most military planners couldn't match. But success brought its own dangers as federal agencies finally recognized the threat. The FBI established a task force specifically targeting the cooperation between Dominic, Victor, and the Mexican cartel, dedicating resources and personnel to breaking what they called the most sophisticated criminal alliance in the country. Isabella identified the task force early through her law enforcement contacts and began planning countermeasures. But this was different from handling individual detectives or local prosecutors. The FBI had resources and patience and legal tools that made them far more dangerous than any criminal rival. The task force leader was a woman named Agent Sarah Chun who'd built her career prosecuting organized crime and had a reputation for obsessive dedication and tactical brilliance. Isabella researched Agent Chun extensively and realized with uncomfortable recognition that they were similar personalities on opposite sides of a conflict, both using intelligence backgrounds and strategic thinking to achieve their objectives. The difference was Chun served institutions, while Isabella served one man, but the methodologies were nearly identical. Isabella told Dominic that Chun would be their most dangerous opponent because she'd think like Isabella thought, anticipate moves before they happened, and probe for weaknesses with patience that criminals usually lacked. Dominic asked if Isabella could outmaneuver someone playing her own game, and Isabella admitted she didn't know, that facing an equal opponent would come down to who made fewer mistakes under pressure. The FBI task force began building their case methodically, surveilling operations and documenting connections between the three organizations. Isabella countered by implementing even stricter operational security, moving all sensitive communications to encrypted channels the FBI couldn't crack, and ensuring that no single person in any organization knew enough to provide prosecution-worthy testimony. But Chin adapted to every countermeasure, finding new avenues and pressure points. She began targeting the families of organization members, not with violence, but with legal pressure and financial audits that made normal life impossible. The message was clear. Working for this alliance would cost more than any paycheck was worth. The pressure created stress fractures in the alliance as lower-level members started talking to the FBI or simply walking away from criminal life. Isabella watched her carefully constructed security architecture start crumbling and recognized that Chun had found the vulnerability. You could have perfect operational security, but if you made people's families miserable, they'd eventually sacrifice anything to make it stop. Isabella told Dominic they needed to shift strategies from defense to offense. That Chin's obsessive focus on this case meant she'd sacrificed work-life balance and personal relationships for career advancement. If they could create pressure in Chin's personal life the way Chun was pressuring their organizations, maybe the FBI would redirect her to less stressful assignments. Isabella investigated Chin's background and found exactly what she expected. A brilliant woman who'd sacrificed everything for her career, no spouse or children, estranged from family who thought she worked too much, living in a small apartment because she spent 80 hours a week at the office. But Chin had one weakness, a sister with medical problems who depended on Chin's financial support for treatment. Isabella immediately vetoed any plan to threaten the sister because that crossed lines she wouldn't cross even in this world, but it gave her a different idea. If Chin's motivation was career advancement and saving her sister, what if someone offered to help with the sister's medical bills in exchange for Chin's career taking a different direction away from this task force? Isabella made an anonymous approach through a medical charity offering to cover the sister's treatment costs completely, no strings attached except gratitude. Chun investigated the charity and found it legitimate with funding from sources that appeared clean. Her sister's treatment got fully funded, and Chun found herself confused about the sudden philanthropic interest. Then Isabella sent an encrypted message suggesting that some problems resolve themselves when people stopped forcing confrontations that harmed everyone involved, that Chin's sister would continue receiving care as long as certain investigations remained appropriately unfocused. It was barely a threat and mostly just pointing out coincidences, but Chin was smart enough to understand the subtext. Agent Chun faced an impossible choice. Continue her obsessive pursuit of a case that might never result in conviction and risk her sister's medical care, or accept that sometimes targets were too sophisticated to take down through conventional investigation. She spent 2 weeks wrestling with the decision before finally requesting transfer to a different task force, citing burnout and personal obligations. The FBI reassigned her, and the investigation into the three-organization alliance stalled as the new task force leader lacked Chen's strategic brilliance and obsessive dedication. Isabella had won by finding the one leverage point that made even a dedicated federal agent reconsider whether the fight was worth the cost. With the FBI pressure reduced, the alliance between Dominic, Victor, and the cartel stabilized into something approaching legitimate business operations. They began investing criminal profits into legal enterprises, using restaurants and real estate and construction companies to launder money while creating actual economic value. Isabella designed the entire structure using shell companies and international banking that made tracking nearly impossible even for investigators who knew what they were looking for. Dominic's organization transformed from traditional crime family into something resembling a multinational corporation that happened to have some illegal divisions alongside the legitimate ones. 3 years after Isabella had slipped that warning note across a restaurant table, she stood with Dominic at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center their foundation had funded in an impoverished neighborhood. Politicians praised their philanthropy, and community members thanked them for investing where others wouldn't. Isabella watched the ceremony and marveled at the strange journey from CIA operative to waitress to crime boss's wife and strategic architect. Dominic squeezed her hand and whispered that none of this existed without her, that she transformed his violent empire into something with actual legacy beyond bodies and territory disputes. That evening, they hosted a private dinner celebrating the community center and their anniversary. Victor attended with his wife. Hector brought representatives from the cartel leadership, and Marco stood, as always, watching over Dominic, but now with genuine affection for Isabella, who'd become family rather than just the boss's wife. During dinner, Dominic stood and made a toast thanking Isabella for saving his life that night in the restaurant, but more importantly, for saving his soul, for showing him that being powerful didn't require being a monster, that loyalty and strategy could achieve more than fear and violence ever had. Isabella responded with her own toast, acknowledging that she'd spent years serving institutions that claimed moral authority while doing terrible things in shadows, but that Dominic had given her something those institutions never had, the freedom to act on her values without political considerations overriding ethical ones, the security to build something lasting with someone who understood her completely. She told the room that people always said criminals had no honor, but she'd found more genuine loyalty and integrity in this world than she'd ever found in government service. The room erupted in agreement and celebration, criminal leaders and their families raising glasses to partnership and prosperity. Later that night, alone in their bedroom, Dominic asked Isabella if she had any regrets about the path her life had taken. Isabella thought about the question seriously before answering that she regretted the people she'd failed to save over the years, both during her CIA service and since, but that she didn't regret choosing him in this life. She told him that everyone made choices about what they valued and who they served, and she'd chosen to serve one man with clear vision over institutions with murky agendas. Dominic pulled her close and told her that choosing her had been the easiest decision of his life, that the moment she'd slipped him that warning note, he'd known she was different from everyone else who'd ever orbited his world. They fell asleep tangled together, while security systems Isabella had designed monitored their estate, and intelligence networks she'd built tracked threats across the city. In the morning, they'd wake and continue building their empire, protecting what they'd created and proving that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships created the most powerful foundations. Isabella had saved Dominic's life that night in the restaurant, but he'd saved hers too by offering purpose and partnership when she'd been drowning in meaningless service work. Together, they'd built something that transcended traditional definitions of right and wrong, something that operated in moral gray areas, but with crystal clear loyalty and commitment to protecting their people and their future. Sometimes the most dangerous choice becomes the most liberating one when you're brave enough to follow your instincts over society's expectations. Isabella traded government service and moral certainty for criminal partnership and ethical complexity, but gained authentic purpose and genuine love. She proved that intelligence and loyalty matter more than which side of the law you operate on. That protecting the people you love sometimes requires operating outside systems designed to constrain rather than enable. Her journey from CIA operative to crime boss's strategic partner showed that the most powerful transformations come from trusting your skills and following your heart, even when the destination looks nothing like the life you planned. Sometimes, saving one person in a critical moment changes everything, and the gratitude and love that grows from that moment builds foundations stronger than any institution could provide. Smash that subscribe button if this story had you on the edge of your seat. Drop a comment telling me if you'd have passed that note or stayed out of it. Share with someone who loves intelligence thrillers and unexpected romance. The next story is coming, and it's darker and more intense than anything we've done before.